A beginning without guarantees. The story of Steve Jobs begins not with privilege, but with rejection. Before he could speak, a choice was made for him. His biological mother, a young, scared student, decided to give him up for adoption. Her one condition, that her son be raised by college graduates, by people who could promise him a future. But fate had other plans. The first family backed out, and then came Paul and Clara Jobs, a mechanic and a bookkeeper. No college degrees, no status, just love. And somehow, that was exactly what Steve needed. Later, he would say, "My parents were Paul and Clara. They loved me, and I have always felt special." No map, just a compass. Steve was curious, restless, bold. He questioned things. At 17, he went to Reed College and a liberal arts school in Oregon. His parents had no money, but promised to spend everything to give him a shot. And just months in, he dropped out. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to waste time on what didn't feel right. He slept on friends' floors, collected Coke bottles for spare change, ate free meals at a Hare Krishna temple every Sunday, and he audited classes that sparked his curiosity: philosophy, design, and most importantly, calligraphy. First principle: intuition is your real compass. You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward. Years later, he would say, "If I hadn't dropped in on that calligraphy class, the Mac would have never had such beautiful typography." What seemed useless at the time became revolutionary. Spiritual hunger, not just technical drive. Steve traveled to India searching for truth. He meditated, fasted, read Zen philosophy. And when he returned, he wasn't just a dropout, he was a seeker. He began to see computers not as machines, but as instruments for the mind and soul. Not just tools, but portals to human potential. What this chapter teaches us: you don't need a perfect beginning to create a legendary life. The world may offer you a map, but your heart will always be the better guide. And sometimes, the things that make no sense now will one day define who you are. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. Steve Jobs. This wasn't the start of a tech company. This was the birth of a mindset. Apple: genius, chaos, and rebellion. Two friends, one garage, and an idea. In 1976, a 21-year-old Steve Jobs and his shy, brilliant friend Steve Wozniak founded a company called Apple. Their first office? A simple garage in Los Altos, California, Jobs' childhood home. Their first mission? Not to build a company, but to bring computers to the people. Wozniak was the engineering wizard. Jobs was the dreamer, the fire starter, the one who saw what could be. The computer is the most remarkable tool we've ever built. It's like a bicycle for the mind. Steve Jobs. From day one, Jobs believed computers should be beautiful, simple, and human. Not just wires and code, but emotion, design, and soul. Apple and the first spark. Their first product, the Apple I, wasn't flashy. It had no case, no screen, no keyboard, just a motherboard. But Jobs sold it anyway. He convinced a local computer shop to buy 50 units up front. The seed was planted, and soon came Apple II, a major leap. It was one of the first computers with color graphics, and it sold by the thousands. At just 23, Jobs became a millionaire, but money never interested him. What drove him was possibility, and the urge to build something iconic. Macintosh. Art meets technology. In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, the first mass-market computer with a mouse and graphical interface. It was bold, elegant, and deeply intuitive. To launch it, Jobs created the now legendary 1984 Super Bowl ad, directed by Ridley Scott. A dystopian scene where a lone rebel smashes conformity with a sledgehammer. It wasn't just a commercial, it was a manifesto. Apple wasn't selling a machine, but it was selling freedom of thought. But genius has a shadow. Jobs was obsessed with excellence. He pushed his team to the limit. demanded perfection, dismissed mediocrity. If a shade of gray was slightly off, the whole product had to be redone. Some admired him, others feared him. He could be cold, harsh, unrelenting, but underneath it all was one thing: a burning desire to create something that mattered. He didn't want to make products. He wanted to make art with circuits and code. The unthinkable. Fired from Apple. But his fire eventually burned too hot. Tensions rose. Power struggles followed, and in 1985, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he created. Let that sink in. He built Apple. He made it a household name, and they kicked him out. I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone. Steve Jobs. He was 30, famous, lost, alone, and yet something deeper began to awaken. Lesson from this chapter. Second principle: sometimes life breaks your plans, not to punish you, but to rebuild you. Jobs later said, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." Why? Because it stripped him of identity and gave him back freedom. Steve Jobs built a revolution in a garage. He made machines human and computers beautiful. But his intensity cost him everything. And yet, that loss was the start of something even greater. The world thought his story was over, but for Steve Jobs it was only the end of Act 1. Exile that revealed the essence falling into the unknown. 1985. Steve Jobs had everything and lost it. Fame, money, headlines, gone. But what he lost most painfully was purpose. For a time he drifted. No team, no products, no stages. Just a man trying to figure out who he was without Apple. But inside, something quietly reignited. I still loved what I did. That love, not money, not status, became the seed of his rebirth. NeXT, a computer ahead of its time. Soon after, Jobs founded a new company, NeXT Inc., its goal? To create the most powerful and beautifully designed computer in the world, for universities, scientists, and dreamers. NeXT machines were stunning. Matte black magnesium, cutting-edge operating systems, and software light years ahead. But they were too expensive. Too niche. But genius has a shadow. Jobs was obsessed with excellence. He pushed his team to the limit, demanded perfection, dismissed mediocrity. If a shade of gray was slightly off, the whole product had to be redone. Some admired him, others feared him. He could be cold, harsh, unrelenting, but underneath it all was one thing: a burning desire to create something that mattered. He didn't want to make products. He wanted to make art with circuits and code. The unthinkable. Fired from Apple. But his fire eventually burned too hot. Tensions rose. Power struggles followed, and in 1985, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he created. Let that sink in. He built Apple. He made it a household name, and they kicked him out. I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone. Steve Jobs. He was 30, famous, lost, alone, and yet something deeper began to awaken. Lesson from this chapter. Pixar didn't just succeed, it rewrote the future of storytelling and made Steve Jobs a billionaire once again, rediscovering the real Steve. These years in exile did something Apple never could. They humbled him, they refined him, they gave him space to create without pressure and lead without ego. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was crafting from the soul again. I'm convinced that about half of what separates successful entrepreneurs from the non-successful ones is pure perseverance. The real victory. Ironically, these so-called lost years would give birth to the tools that would later save Apple. Because in building NeXT and Pixar, Steve wasn't just building products, he was building himself. Wiser, deeper, more focused than ever before. Steve Jobs fell, but kept moving. He built two companies not for success, but for soul. NeXT gave him vision, Pixar gave him joy, and together they made him whole. True rebirth doesn't happen in victory. It happens in the quiet, when no one is watching and you still choose to rise. The return and the revolution. Apple on the edge of collapse. By 1996, Apple, the company Jobs had once made iconic, was sinking. Too many products, no direction, dwindling sales. Once seen as a tech pioneer, Apple was now mocked as a dying brand. The company was burning cash and losing relevance. Some even said Apple should just be sold. And then the board made a bold move. They acquired NeXT, the very company Steve Jobs had built during his exile. Not for Steve, but for the operating system. Fate has a strange sense of irony. The prodigal founder returns. At first, Jobs was brought back as a consultant, but anyone who knew him could see, and this wasn't a cameo, it was the beginning of a second act. By 1997, he was back as interim CEO, and Apple's employees were unsure whether to celebrate or panic. But Jobs? He walked in with absolute clarity. We're going to simplify everything, and he did, ruthlessly, cutting to the core. At the time, Apple was making over 12 different product lines. Jobs asked one question: which ones would you recommend to your friend? No one had a clear answer, so he drew a simple 2x2 grid, consumer/professional times desktop/portable, and canceled everything that didn't fit. 4 products, that's it. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. This wasn't just about business, it was a mindset. Less noise, more meaning. iMac. Design meets desire. In 1998, Apple released the iMac, a translucent, colorful, all-in-one computer that looked nothing like anything on the market. It wasn't just tech. It was joyful. It was playful. It said, "This is not your dad's computer, this is yours." Sales exploded. Apple was cool again. iPod, iTunes, the music revolution. In 2001 came the iPod, a sleek white device with a click wheel and a promise. 1,000 songs in your pocket. But the magic wasn't just hardware. Jobs launched iTunes, a full digital ecosystem. He persuaded major music labels to let users buy songs for 99 cents. It reshaped how the world experienced music. Simplicity, ownership, accessibility. And just like that, Apple became more than a computer company. It became a cultural force. iPhone, the world changes. Then in 2007, Steve Jobs walked on stage and said, "Today we're introducing 3 revolutionary products. A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator." Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. The world stopped. This wasn't a phone, it was a platform, a gateway, a revolution in your pocket, apps, touchscreens, mobile photography, social media. Everything we take for granted today started there. But behind the stage, a battle. In 2003, Jobs had been diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He kept it mostly private, working through pain, treatments, surgeries. He fought to stay alive, not just to see another product launch, but to fulfill the mission he felt called to. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Steve Jobs, Stanford Commencement, 2005 iPad, one final stroke. In 2010, a year before his death, Jobs introduced the iPad, a product category no one believed in until it sold millions. His voice was weaker, but the fire was still there. Always. Steve Jobs didn't just return, he rebuilt Apple from the inside out. He brought focus, vision, and a ruthless pursuit of simplicity. He didn't follow the market, he reshaped it. And he turned Apple into the most valuable company on earth. 4th principle: simplicity isn't a design choice. It's a philosophy, and it's what makes the impossible inevitable. The meaning of life and what you leave behind. One speech, a lifetime distilled. In 2005, Steve Jobs stood before the graduating class of Stanford University. He wasn't there as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had faced death and come back with clarity. He shared 3 stories from his life, and in doing so, he gave the world one of the most powerful modern philosophies of living. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Not about tech, about truth. Steve Jobs' greatest legacy isn't the iPhone. It isn't the MacBook or the iPad or even Apple itself. It's the reminder that you can build a life that is both wildly ambitious and deeply personal. That success and soul are not enemies, that you can and should trust your inner voice, even when the world doubts it. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. The final lesson: simplicity, purpose, and love. Jobs showed us that the most complex things, design, business, technology, life itself, can be reduced to a simple core. What do you love? What matters most? What will still be true when you're gone? Fifth principle: live as if today is your last, but create as if the world will feel your work for 100 years. He did both. What Steve Jobs left behind? A company, yes. Products? Revolutionary. But more than anything, a shift in how we see creativity, leadership, and life itself. He proved that. You don't need to start perfect. You don't need to avoid failure. You just need to stay true to your vision and keep walking. We're here to put a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why even be here? Closing reflection. Steve Jobs was far from flawless. He was intense, stubborn, complicated, but he lived with urgency, with clarity, with fire. And that fire still burns in every person who dreams bigger than their circumstance, who follows intuition over expectation, who creates not to impress, but to express. This was the story of Steve Jobs, not the story of a tech icon, but of a man who turned pain into power, simplicity into strength, and death into the most honest teacher of all. Let his story remind you, you don't have to know how the dots connect. You just have to move forward with faith and leave behind something that matters. Because that's not just success, that's legacy. Thank you for watching, and remember, your story isn't over. It's just beginning.